record and also okay, so over to DJ and Kelly.
Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. We're glad that you could join us today. As Michael said, this session is entitled Understanding the Big Picture, the connection between disability and poverty, and why financial capability matters. So real quickly, we just want to bring up the training objectives. So we are hoping that by the end of today's webinar, you will have an increased understanding of the intersection of disability and poverty, including the receipt of Social Security benefits. We're hoping that you'll have some increased knowledge of the most applicable Social Security benefits for youth and the associated work incentives. Well, just a quick note, while we do recognize that kind of benefits management and work incentives counseling is typically referred to as work incentives planning and assistance, we decided to go with the more kind of common vernacular of Social Security benefits in this presentation, because that tends to be how people talk about it and know about it. And so we just wanted to be consistent in that way. And with that, hopefully you'll have an increased understanding of the importance of ongoing Social Security benefits planning and the use of work incentives counseling, especially for young folks, as one part of kind of that larger financial picture. And we're hoping that there will be increased knowledge of resources to support financial capability for youth and their families. So I know that there were a number of kind of pre-questions prior to the webinar, so we will do our best to kind of incorporate and hit some of those. For those that we don't kind of get to, we hope that you will check out kind of the resources that we are listing in the slides, because we think that those can help with additional research that folks may have, or additional questions that folks may have to help them do some more of that research. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So we wanted to start out with y'all with just talking about kind of some general disability and poverty demographics. So we have a quick side-by-side here. So the employment rate for people with disabilities, this is according to the American Community Survey. So this is looking at 2018 data, but that employment rate was 24%, whereas the employment rate for people without disabilities is 67.3%. So clearly people with disabilities, as we all know, are employed at a fraction of the rate of their non-disabled peers, which obviously is going to have some impact as it relates to their financial standing, right? Their financial picture. When we look at people with disabilities, approximately 8.2% of the population holds a bachelor's degree or higher, compared with 36.5% for people without disabilities. So people with disabilities, again, achieving a bachelor's degree or higher at about half the rate of their non-disabled peers. So again, which we also know that education and post-secondary education certainly has an impact on overall lifetime earnings, which again is going to impact that larger financial picture. Now it starts to get really ugly. People with disabilities are living in poverty 26.9%, compared with 12.2%. So more than double the rate of non-disabled peers are living in poverty. And that's ultimately one of the things that we really wanted to talk to you all about today. So when we think about people with disabilities and we think about, you know, people that are living at or below the poverty level, and we think about that Venn diagram, it's gonna be a pretty large overlay when we think about people with disabilities. So 23% of folks had extreme difficulty paying bills as far as people with disabilities, compared to 9% of those that don't have disabilities. And we borrowed that statistic from our good friends at the National Disability Institute, who put out a great report with funding from FINRA. Would highly suggest people check that out. 12% of people with disabilities are unbanked, compared with 6% of people without disabilities. So again, unbanked at double the rate. For those of you who may not be familiar with what unbanked means, essentially that means that a person does not have any type of formal relationship with any type of formal financial institution. So they do not have a checking account, they do not have a savings account, they do not have any type of investments or retirement, any of that type of stuff, typically looking at unbanked. And finally, people with disabilities are more likely to use costly non-banking options. Well, clearly, if we have people that are unbanked at double the rate, then yeah, they're going to potentially engage in the use of non-banking options, which can consider payday loans, checks, cashing, right? Can also include kind of some of the grocery store stuff that we see, like people are just cashing checks or asking, you know, a grocery store to cash their check. And we know that oftentimes that comes with increased fees, right? So just kind of wanted to point out some of those main statistics. All right. So in addition to kind of looking at what the statistics say, we want to look at the extra cost of disability. So despite the fact that there's a proven connection between disability and poverty, there seems to be a general lack of an acknowledgement about the additional cost of disability as it relates to economic needs. And so as a result of that, the amount of resources that a person with a disability needs are oftentimes like grossly underestimated, which in turn contributes to a sustained poverty status for individuals with disabilities, right? So like one of the things that we think about here, essentially what it's saying, and we kind of see this in the next statement, is that when people experience a disability, they have additional costs that a person without a disability does not have. And in fact, when we look at a current report from the National Disability Institute, again, our good friends there, about the extra costs of living with disability, households containing an adult with a work disability are estimated to require, on average, 28% more income. So when we think about that, that's an additional $17,690 a year for a household at the median income level in order to obtain that same standard of living as comparable as the household without a person with the disability. So in other words, not only are people with disabilities employed at a fraction of the rate of their non-disabled peers, when they are employed, they actually have to earn more in order to enjoy the same standard of living that a household without disabilities would have. So again, looking at that intersection, we see how disability and poverty are linked there. Just wanted to put this out there. The federal poverty guidelines established by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services every year. So this number changes every year. But the poverty line, or 100% of the poverty level for a family of one, so a single person, no dependents, is $12,880 a year. That's $1,073 per month. There is an adjusted cost of inflation for Alaska and Hawaii. And as we see the size of the family grow, we see that income come up a little bit. So a family of two is $17,420, and a family of three, $21,960, and so on. So you might be like, DJ, why are you talking to us about the poverty lines or the poverty level and not talking to us about disability? Well, that's because now I'm going to talk to you about disability, right? So Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, which is the needs-based disability program under Social Security, is the one that administers payments. And do you know how much they administer a month? $794 is the federal benefit rate, or what we consider the cash benefit for an SSI individual. $794 a month. I'd like people to just kind of like stop and think about that for a second and think about $794 a month and where that goes and how quickly that goes. And when we think about that, that's $9,530 a year. Oh, wait, let's go back. I'm sorry, $9,530 a year is less than 100% of the federal poverty level for a family of one, right? And it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because in addition to this, in order to maintain eligibility, someone can't have more than $2,000 in any type of resources. Talk about that in more detail a little bit later, because that particularly tends to impact people's access to medical care, which is a big component for many folks. But just wanted to kind of point this out. So again, if you are an individual who's in receipt of SSI, your cash benefit max rate there is $794 a month, which is under 100% of the federal poverty level. For an eligible couple, that goes up to $1,191 a month in cash payment, and $14,000 per year, which again, if we go back and we look at a family of two, that's still under 100% of that federal poverty level, right? So let's talk about the difference between situational poverty and generational poverty, because there is a difference, right? So situational poverty occurs as a lack of resources due to a particular event, right? This could be disability, like sudden onset of disability, right? This could be as a result of chronic illness. Situational poverty often occurs when when folks maybe go through a divorce because they go from dual income to a single income. It can happen as a result of a death in the family. There are many reasons that situational poverty occurs, right? But the point is that lack of resources in particular comes as a result of a specific event. Now, when we look at generational poverty, we're talking about that lack of multiple resources for at least 2 generations. Now, what's really interesting about this, though, is that pattern actually begins to surface much sooner if we're talking about someone in a family who lives with others who've experienced generational poverty. In other words, if you are a young person who is living at or below the poverty level, and you're living with your mother and perhaps your grandmother, and your grandmother was also a child who lived at or below the poverty level, then the reality is we continue to see this occur much sooner. So in addition to this, one of the other things that we want to talk about as a result of generational poverty that can occur is this whole concept of emergent disability. So when we look at the research, and Kelly's going to kind of detail this for us in much greater detail, but when we look at the research, a lot of times, essentially, when you are living in poverty and you are experiencing that lack of resources, which includes lack of resources to access, like such as stable food, can include lack of access to preventative health care and many other aspects that are kind of baseline things that help keep a young person healthy, then as a result of that lack of access, emergent disability can occur. So we see higher incidences of things like diabetes. We see higher incidences of things like depression, anxiety, other mental health challenges, et cetera. So that's something to keep in mind. So not only are disability and poverty linked, but poverty itself can actually lead to disability. So there were some studies done, and I'll kind of cite them in the next slide, but around resource scarcity and stress and how those things impact decision-making. So this is really, really key, y'all, especially for the fact, like when we think about our young people and in particular, our young people's families. So when we're talking about students and youth, this is something that's going to actually impact our students and youth, right? And I think that we understand that to some degree, right? Like we understand if you're really hungry, or if a student or youth is really hungry, then that can pull kind of their distraction, right? And that's why we have things like the free and reduced lunch program and other types of, community supports that try to address these things, because there is a recognition around the fact that scarcity actually does pull time and attention. And that actually is something that applies to adults too. So when we think about our students and youth, not only may they be experiencing scarcity, likely their parents or their families are experiencing scarcity, especially if they're in receipt of SSI. So they're managing resources that requires increased attention and self-control that leads to a level of depletion. If you think about the fact that you're constantly trying to manage what you don't have, right? Like that's a level of problem solving. Guess what? That's mentally and emotionally exhausting, is it not? So that leads to that depletion. And depletion, what is that associated with? Well, the research tells us it's associated with poor decision-making, because you're so focused on the current short-term problem. You're so focused in the here and now. The reality is you can't actually think about and be able to foresee kind of what those long-term issues lead to, right? So it really is about this idea that scarcity can ultimately, impact our long-term decision-making. And this is something that happens to young people and their families. So Sendil, as a Harvard economist, along with a couple of his colleagues, including professor of psychology, did a study, right? They looked at how scarcity works and what kind of the mental tax of poverty is relative to how scarcity impacts it. And they looked at it from the fields of psychology and economics, as well as some of their own kind of empirical research. And based on their analysis of the data, they wanted to learn if scarcity steals that mental capacity, right? If you are poor, hungry, lonely, time-strapped, like what happens as a result of that? Well, guess what? Just as I was just talking about, poverty is actually something that can deplete parents' cognitive resources, therefore leaving little space for making everyday decisions about parenting. So when we think about our young students and youth who we're working with, and we think about their families, and I know that I will fully admit this, like I've been guilty along the way as a practitioner of saying, like, as a VR counselor saying, oh, like this family isn't engaged. Because what I didn't realize was it's not that the family wasn't engaged. It's just that the family didn't necessarily have a lot of those cognitive resources and that extra in order to be able to be really involved, because they were constantly trapped in that, pattern of scarcity and trying to address, what those current needs are. So this is a challenge to everybody to really think about how we talk about our young people and their families, and really kind of think about what the impact of poverty could be and what role that could be playing. Parents who have low income are at greater risk for depression and anxiety, or poverty's mental tax, which I mentioned earlier. And parents who are distracted or depressed, like families' life is less likely characterized, or more likely rather, to be characterized by conflict and emotional withdrawal rather than nurturing support and relationships with children. I don't know about you, but if you can think about any time in your life where you've been really stressed out about money, because I do think that that has happened for a lot of folks and continues to happen for more and more folks. But if you can just think about that moment and then think about, you know, if that wasn't really, really significant, if that magnifies, and then it's a constant state of what that stress feels like, I think you can all start to feel kind of those knots in your stomachs raising up, right? Okay, so in addition, the behavioral economics research that was done out of Harvard includes the idea that impulsive behavior or poor performance in school, poor financial decision-making may be products of that feeling of scarcity. So again, like we need to really think about, you know, what is that impact of scarcity? How could this be happening? This should be hopefully kind of keen for folks, like kind of that trauma-informed approach, right? Like not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. So really like understanding the situation that people are in is going to be really key. Just thinking about scarcity taxes the mind and increases stress, as we were just talking about, as I'm like encouraging you all to think about. Honestly, I've got a knot in my stomach just thinking about times in my life right now, kind of going back to that. So this really means that our policies and programs, we need to consider scarcity-induced behavior, right? In our design. Like one of the things that we should be thinking about relative to scarcity and poverty is like, how is that impacting our student and youth ability to show up in the classroom? How is that impacting our student youth family ability to participate in the special education and VR processes? Does this mean that our students and youth and their families may have a hard time participating in developing their IEP or developing their IPE, right? So these are all things we want to think about. And then we really want to think about how do we redesign these programs in a way that are going to be more supportive, right? So how do we redesign the cockpit, the program, rather than the pilot? Because it's not necessarily the personal decisions, although there's, you know, certainly a strand of research out there that says that personal decisions are responsible for poverty, but there's actually a lot more research out there that says that there are structural conditions, which we've talked a bit about. Kelly?
So thank you, DJ, for giving us this nice overview and big picture of poverty. I want to talk a little bit about that intersect between poverty and disability. So disability is both a cause and a consequence of poverty. And on the slide here, you see that cycle, if you will. So as a cause, disability often means being or underemployed, and it can lead to a loss of job, reduced earnings, barriers to education, barriers to skill development, and many other challenges that can lead to economic hardship. Disability is a consequence as poverty limits access, and DJ talked about this a little bit, but limits access to quality health care and preventive services, and increases the likelihood that a person lives in an environment that negatively impacts their health. So in short, the intersect of poverty and disability is a cycle. One can impact the other. On this next slide, we really talk about the impact that poverty has on a person with a disability. And DJ nicely laid out some of the different definitions, if you will, of poverty. But poverty impacts the ability of somebody to really receive a quality education. And if somebody doesn't have a quality education, it can present barriers to that school to work transition, or really accessing and utilizing these really important transition services, both within the school and those adult services that we connect our students to. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about navigating these services. These are often unjointed, uncoordinated services, and families and youth are often left on their own to navigate and try to find the right services. And that leaves them frustrated and confused. And we need to think about not only the service system within transition and all the education services and VR services and DDA services, but when you're looking at working with a youth and family who has a disability and is living close or in close to or in poverty, there's also all these services in the poverty world or the human service world, and they don't talk to each other very well. And so these families have to navigate all that. And again, it leads to a lot of frustration, and a lot of families just sort of throw up their hands. So living in poverty and not having really that financial stability can diminish families and youth choices, as DJ had mentioned, but it really impacts opportunities that they are given and opportunities to be more financially independent. So let's talk about some additional research. So there is a lot of research going on around poverty and disability. A number of these researchers are within our field of education and transition and VR. And some of the things that they found, that income poverty is associated with higher rates of hardship. So we do know that people with disabilities are considerably more likely to experience income poverty compared to those persons without disabilities. They also stay in poverty oftentimes longer than people without disabilities. So in some sense, income poverty can be a predictor of hardships. And when we're talking about hardships, how that can be defined is the ability to meet essential expenses. DJ also touched on this, things like housing, food, healthcare. So these are the hardships that these people face. Research has also found that mental health and debt are associated. People with mental health concerns can find that they are triggered by unexpected changes, and that will send them in this debt spiral. So think of somebody who may be experiencing mania. They may go on a spending spree, or somebody else may just avoid or ignore financial responsibilities. So there is this association between mental health and debt that we need to be aware of. We also know that mental and physical conditions underlying a disability make it necessary for that individual to consume more resources just to meet their basic needs. So they are, and again, DJ touched on this a bit, that they need to access additional healthcare related resources. And this does negatively impact their economic well-being. So their out-of-pocket expenses, healthcare expenses, are 3 times that of people without disabilities. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, research has been conducted on children living in poverty, and children really who are growing up in poor housing conditions, or experiencing housing instability or overcrowding, or even food insecurity. And these young people, these children, are more likely to experience poor health and experience accidents or injuries, infectious diseases that could lead to long-term disabilities. So there is some of that additional research happening. So we're going to shift gears here for a minute and have you take a minute to think about this question here.
Yeah, so you'll notice on the screen, and I just had the opportunity to sort of catch up on the chat. Boy, y'all have been busy, love it. But we really were hoping that you could think about, the students and youth and families that your agency as a vocational rehabilitation agency, or as a school or local school district, or maybe even at the state level, works with. And how can a lack of income and or resources impact participation and quality of life? And we're really encouraging you to think about that for the young person, for your youth and your student, but also their family, because we know how important, familiar situations are for young people. So, if you think about that a bit, Kelly and I have kind of thrown some things out there, but yeah, transportation is a big one. And that's one of those ones too, y'all, where if you're talking about a family who maybe doesn't have their own personal transportation and they're reliant on public transportation, and sometimes that public transportation, they got to take 2 or 3 buses just to get to a school for an IEP meeting, or they got to take 2 or 3 buses to get to the VR office for a meeting. We need to be thinking about those things, because sometimes when it comes down to, I can either spend this money on getting to the school or getting to the VR office, or I can spend this money on diapers for my child's younger sibling, right? Like, what do you think people are going to pick in that instance? So again, just kind of thinking about that. Access to recreational opportunities is another big one. P.S. that also really highlights for us kind of the mental tax that can come with it, right? If parents are constantly overwhelmed, right? A, they're not going to have money to help the young person participate in a recreational opportunity, but B, even if they do happen to have that money, are they going to have the capacity and energy to be able to support the young person and ensure that they can get to every one of those recreational opportunities? So again, y'all have so much great stuff coming in through the chat. We're super pleased that you all are thinking about this. And with that, Kelly, maybe it's time that you bust some myths. Like, who are we going to call?
Myth busting. Let's do this. And again, I want to thank you all for putting your responses in chat. One of them that I just saw pop up that is very timely is that access to technology. We just experienced virtual or remote schooling and services. And if you don't have access to the appropriate technology, you're left behind. So I appreciate the person who, or persons who mentioned that technology. So on to myth busting, and we want to bust some myths about poverty and disability. So poverty is just about being poor. That is a myth. The fact is that poverty and disability is really multidimensional. So we've already talked a little bit about that outer circle that you see there on the screen, that disability leads to poverty and poverty leads to disability. But looking at that inner circle, having a disability and living in poverty also impacts one's social and economic situation. It often isolates them. And if they're isolated, that can lead to and underemployment. Recreational activities popped up in the chat box, just that social network one has. Also within that inner circle is participation in making one's choices. Think about your civil and political rights and responsibilities. If you're somebody who is living in poverty, has a disability, it's oftentimes much harder to participate in those sorts of activities that we all have the right to participate in. So it is really multidimensional. There's not a single characteristic that we can really point to when we talk about that intersect between disability and poverty. So moving on to the next myth, poverty and disability happens to other people. Oftentimes I think when I see photos of poverty, it's often a different country, a third world country, or it's a photo of the inner city. But the fact is, poverty can really affect anybody. As it turns out, the majority of Americans will experience poverty firsthand. So a study done by the Washington Post, March of this last year, indicated that 59% of Americans will spend at least 1 year below the official poverty line. And these are individuals between the ages of 20 and 75. And that number rises to 76% if it includes people who are near that poverty line. So the reason these numbers are so high is that over the course of a lifetime, there are these unanticipated events. For example, we may become sick. We may lose a job. There may be a change in the family dynamic or a split in a family, or you may experience a global pandemic. So these are things that can really move somebody closer to that poverty line or into poverty. Research from the Federal Reserve shows that 37% of Americans in 2019 did not have $400 to cover any unanticipated emergency. So unsurprisingly then, when changes occur, there's little to protect families. So moving into poverty can happen pretty quickly. So bottom line is poverty and disability affects all walks of life. And in the US, children and people from minority populations are more likely to be affected by disability and poverty. And when we talk about disabilities too, we're talking about non-obvious disabilities as well. So mental health concerns, neurodiverse disabilities such as ADD, ADHD. We're really talking about all walks of life here. So moving to the next myth, growing up in poverty has no lasting effect on a person. In truth, poor children begin their journeys at high risk for physical, social, and emotional problems attributed to the lack of nutrition, physical stimulation, and emotional development. And we've talked a little bit about this already. And then these challenges become very difficult for them to overcome. And as they grow up, they are constantly trying to break this cycle of poverty, if you will. So currently there are about 1 million transition age youth who are receiving SSI, Supplemental Security Income benefits, and 60% of those youth who received SSI as a child will go on to receive it as adults. What we know about these youth from lots of research that's been happening over the last few years is that these young adults express a desire to escape poverty and pursue careers. And so that is our job, to help them pursue the careers. But they do face some unique challenges too that I want to point out. And we've mentioned them earlier, this whole notion of uncoordinated service systems, the lack of information about what services are available or even being aware of those services, and then this limited delay in access to key services. And as a result of that, they're often unprepared for education and or employment. And our job is to increase and improve education and employment outcomes for youth. Next myth, we know who these youth are and where to find them. In truth, we need to get a better handle on who we're talking about when we talk about youth with disabilities and youth who are living in poverty. Targeting transition age youth with disabilities and living in poverty is really, really important. As I mentioned earlier, there are about 1 million youth ages 14 to 24 who are receiving SSI annually. And we see that each year more, there are about 200,000 who apply for this. We also know, and I worked on a project recently that this was an important statistic for us to know. But we know that about 25% of school-age youth who are receiving SSI are not on an IEP or a 504. Therefore, they're not receiving services delivered through publicly funded special education, nor are they being connected to those other services that would be available to them, such as vocational rehabilitation, VR, state VR. So these youth really are at a critical point in their career development and beneficiary stage. And DJ and I are very passionate about this population of youth, and we believe this is really the right time to connect them to the right services to help them achieve financial independence. And we're going to talk a little bit more about work incentives in a moment that can really help them achieve financial independence. And so the final myth we want to bust here is SSI recipients can't work or can only earn a small amount. So the fact is, and we believe, it is our assumption that anyone and everyone who chooses to work can work, given the right supports. We also know that people who receive public benefits can work and often are better off financially working than collecting benefits alone, public benefits alone. So we know, again, from research that they're often better off working. And so there are these rules called work incentives that help move those persons, young people in particular, to financial independence. And we're going to talk about some key work incentives in a moment, but we're also going to pause here again and take a moment to reflect and ask you again to put your responses into chat box. But the question is why do you think the narrative is that youth SSI recipients can't work? And I know our jobs are to really address challenges of disability employment and help improve that career development, career trajectory, and help these young people get employed. But in doing that, poverty still remains. And I think this is sort of again, multidimensional situation we need to look at here. And not only do we need to address, as we're looking at moving youth to employment, we need to think about that poverty piece too.
I'm over here like quietly watching the chat box just kind of like blow up. It's pretty awesome. So clearly this is a myth that that kind of resonates with folks. You know, I think some of the most commonly cited ones, which we certainly see here, are, you know, fear of loss of benefits, whether that be the cash benefit or whether that be the medical care that's associated with the benefit. That's a big one. And, you know, the other thing that I would encourage you all to think about too is if that family is in part dependent on this young person's SSI check, yes, that can be another barrier in and of itself, right? Because parents don't necessarily know about the work incentives that are applicable, that their child can work and actually keep pretty much every dime up to $7,700 a year, which I'm going to talk about in a second, without it impacting the check. But there are some key pieces of that have to be navigated, which are not always easy, because once again, going back to, you know, like disjointed systems and convoluted rules, this is a big area of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about benefits, work incentives, and financial capability. So there are typically two benefits that can apply to the population that we're talking about. We are going to specifically focus on one. So we are going to really focus on supplemental security income, which is available to children under age 18. It's need-based income limit less than $794 a month, which is the federal benefit rate, which I talked about earlier, right? And means tested, which means that there are asset limits associated with it. And that asset limit is $2,000. Fun fact, that hasn't changed since this program was introduced. Yeah. Right. There is another benefit, which is a Title II benefit, and it is called CDB, or Childhood Disability Benefit. But this is really for the youth that would fall between the ages of 18, or that would be older than 18. That disability onset had to occur before age 22. And the other piece about this is the child has to be the child of an insured worker that is either disabled themselves and collecting disability insurance through Social Security, and or that parent has to be retired or deceased. So we're actually talking about a much kind of smaller population there. And honestly, typically what does happen when you do get somebody who's receiving one of these benefits, or a Title II benefit, they often are what we call a concurrent, which means that they're receiving both, and then it gets really complicated, and we definitely don't have enough time to cover that today. So for the purposes of this presentation, we decided to really kind of zero in and focus on SSI. And if you have questions about the other ones, well, then I guess that means that you have to like pay attention and come back and see us for another webinar. Kelly, I may have just committed us to something else. I'm sorry. Anyway, so let's talk about Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, which is a Title 16 program. An individual must prove that they are financially eligible for SSI. So again, thinking that it's needs-based. And because it's needs-based, SSI actually looks at all types of income, including earned, unearned, and in kind. Typically, in order to be eligible for SSI, you have to have less than $794 a month in income. And that could be any kind of that income, right? Earned income, unearned income, or in kind, right? And you have to have assets less than $2,000. If we're talking about a couple, that federal benefit rate could go up to $1,191, meaning if you make less than $1,191 a month, and you can have up to $3,000 in assets. The federal benefit rate, which we heard me talk about, is in 2021 equals $794. So that's like the maximum that you can get in a cash payment. That federal benefit rate, y'all, does change from year to year, not by a lot, but it does change. Typically to the medical insurance that is associated with SSI is Medicaid. All right. There's also Medicare and Medicaid. Here's a real quick thing. Those are not the same thing. Even though a lot of people probably think they are, they're not. So you want to think about Medicaid. When we talk SSI, we're talking Medicaid. Medicaid, like SSI, is also means tested. So there's a continued eligibility that looks at income and resources or assets, just like SSI. Guess what? In most places, it's $2,000. Can't have more than that. There are some states where it's a little bit lower. Actually, like I live in Ohio and it's like $1,500. And I'm like, what? But there are some specific, you can actually Google that. And I know I shouldn't be telling you to Google things, but you can actually Google that and figure out what the income rate is or what the asset rate is for your individual state. Because Medicaid is both a state administered or federal and state administered program. Bear with me while I turn my video off since it froze. It's going to vary from state to state, So it is important that you look up or that you be familiar with what your state's income or asset caps are. And you know what? We're going to tell you how to find the people who will know that, because you don't necessarily have to know that. All you need to know is where to go find those people, right? So Medicaid typically covers a wide array of services that range from inpatient hospital stays to home health aides to physician services to occupational therapy to physical therapy, kind of like all those things, right? Like all the things that may be associated with different parts of someone's disability where they need those added services. That's why people are often really in fear of losing their Medicaid, right? And this would especially include parents being fearful of their young person, they're like losing their Medicaid, right? Because they want to, all of us as parents, right? Universally as parents, everybody wants the best and certainly wants their children to have access to what they need, which would include medical care, especially for a child with a disability, right? So of course there's going to be fear around that, which is why we saw you all like blow up the chat going, hey, there's fear of loss of benefits, right? So let's talk about what happens when we have a student or youth that actually does want to work. Can they work and can they not lose that Medicaid and can they not lose that income or their cash benefit? Guess what? They can, because there's something called the Student Earned Income Exclusion, or the SEIE. And it's for SSI beneficiaries who are under the age of 22 and who are regularly attending school. So if you are a special educator on this call, or you're somehow associated with the education industry, this includes high school, college, or training. All right. So for all of our educators, if you have a young person in school who's receiving SSI and they want to go to work or they want to try work out, they can do that using the SEIE. It will ensure that there is no impact to the cash benefit, and they can earn up to $1,930 in a month. Now we do have a cap overall, so $7,770 for the year, but they can earn up to $1,930 per month before their benefits begin to be impacted. So regular school attendance is based on a certain number of hours, depending on whether the student's in high school, college, or training. So that is kind of individually defined, which means you're going to need to find somebody who can do the individualized work incentives counseling and benefits planning, right? So they are often referred to as a benefits planner. They may be referred to as a CWIC, which stands for Community Work Incentive Coordinator. You might hear it shorthand for a WIPA, which is Work Incentives Planning and Assistance. People typically will call these all sorts of things, right? But the important part is that you want to find someone who is certified and trained in how to look at this information, because every individual has their own unique situation, and every individual needs to have an individualized benefits plan done. Like, this is something that if I cannot stress enough to you all, if you walk away from this webinar with nothing else today, besides the fact that we know that disability and poverty are cyclical, because I know you all know that now, The other thing is that if you have a young person that is receipt of SSI, they need to get access to a benefits planner, right? And in addition, they are probably going to need support in some way, shape, or form on how to report wages so that they can ensure that they can claim that student earned income exclusion. All right. It's more than just we have to give the information. We need to ensure that we actually provide that support for that student and their family to ensure, right? Because we talked about some of kind of that capacity and mental bandwidth earlier, right? So we want to make sure that they are supported with the concrete steps of knowing how to report and how to keep those records. So when the Social Security agency comes back or administration comes back and says, there's been an overpayment, they can go, not my fault, that's on you, right? All right. There are a couple other things that can go on. And I'm trying to kind of watch the chat and watch this, but not run out of time. So another typical work incentive, or actually a widely underutilized work incentive, is something called a plan for achieving self-support, which is an SSI work incentive. It allows the beneficiary to set aside income and resources into a protected account for a predetermined duration of time in order to help that person achieve a work goal. So what we're talking about here is the idea that, remember how there was that asset limit of $2,000 and you can't have more than $2,000 in assets, which essentially means you can do no saving, right? Like beyond that $2,000, a PASS plan is a protected savings vehicle that allows that beneficiary to set aside those funds. Now they have to be used for something specific that's tied to a work goal. So this could be, used to be set aside for college because they have a work goal associated with that. But yeah, so it's essentially a protected savings vehicle. Types of expenses that a PASS can be used for include education or training, job coaching, other support services, transportation, job-related items, equipment needed to start a business, most things to achieve that occupational goal. Again, a big key to this is going to be working with a certified work incentive coordinator or a work incentive specialist advocate, depending on where you are, or whatever name it goes by, but somebody, again, who's especially trained to go over this information. Both Virginia Commonwealth University and Cornell University have programs that help to certify folks and make sure that people are really qualified to do this work. So again, you want to find somebody who's got that special expertise. So we've talked a lot today about, like this connection between disability and poverty, and like, now we need to talk about financial capability. And what are we talking about and why are we talking about? Like, what are we talking about and why? Well, we obviously see that when we're talking about folks that are living at or below the poverty level, like there's clearly, additional challenges that come with that, right? So one of the things that we really want to think about is like, how can we build the financial capability of, the students, youth, and families that we're touching, right? So we need financial capability because people with disabilities are more likely, as we talked about, to be unemployed and live in poverty than any other single demographic in the United States. And that's compounded when we start to add other marginalized and systematically excluded groups on that. So if you're a person with a disability and a person of color, if you're a person with a disability and a person of color, or somebody who's LGBTQ identified, etc., it just kind of snowballs from there. Public benefit programs for people with disabilities, especially SSI, are not actually aimed at increasing assets, people, or independence. Because how can you increase assets when you have an asset cap? How can you work towards independence when if you earn more than this amount, like you lose your medical coverage, right? So again, more so than any other population on a fixed income, services and policies do not hold the expectation of economic self-sufficiency. There are a lot of great organizations out there that are doing really great advocating and lobbying work around this to change the legislation. I can't get too much into that because anyway, we'll leave that alone. But financial capability encompasses multiple aspects of behavior relating to how individuals manage their resources and how they make financial decisions, including factors they consider and the skill sets they use. It is a multidimensional concept that requires looking at individual behavior from various angles. So of course it's a multidimensional concept because poverty is multidimensional, right? So of course we need a multidimensional strategy to address that multidimensional challenge. So there are a few things that we're going to talk about today relative to some resources that we would encourage folks to look at. As far as the financial literacy piece goes, right? So this is really, talking to folks about finances, especially young people, starting early, helping to link them to some of these resources, and setting the foundation for what financial literacy is, or why we need to be aware of our finances, And not just the disability specific part, y'all. We need the whole financial picture, right? We need the whole financial picture plus the specific stuff to disabilities. So for young people, Money Smart for grades 6 to 8, really good, go there. Money Smart for young people, ages 12 to 20. So these essentially, y'all, are modules that are that give you all of the material. So as a VR counselor or as an educator, if you wanted to do, I don't know, like you wanted to teach a class or you wanted to do a service to a group, this would be an excellent thing to use, right? This curriculum sets you up. It's age appropriate based on kind of these ages here. It's going to talk about things that are relevant. I know as like young people professionals that you all are, the fact that you're well-versed in young like working with young folks, you're going to have really fun things to add. You're going to find the cool memes and GIFs. You're going to make it really fun. So like definitely check those out. Next piece, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, or CFPB, Your Money, Your Goals. This is a great individualized curriculum. They have these like really handy booklets. It's all free, y'all, all free, okay? And they have a companion guide for people with disabilities. And I see Tompkins, you have been very active in the chat, Tompkins Workforce Center, and I know who you are and I love it. And you're talking about hands-on banking, which I didn't include on these slides, but super good point. Y'all Google hands-on banking. It's a good one. And maybe I'll update the slides before they go out somewhere. But CFPB, Your Money, Your Goals, the companion guide for people with disabilities is also really helpful. That really kind of looks at the integration and marriage of how do we look at our larger financial picture in addition to thinking about what our benefits look like. We need active and ongoing benefits and work incentives counseling. If you want to learn more about SSI and SSI for youth in particular, we've included the SSI Toolkit for Youth, which was developed from the Youth Technical Assistance Center, which was actually out of Cornell, who does one of the major trainings. So really, really good information there. There's like 6 or 8 modules, don't quote me on that, but really strongly recommend that you do that. The other thing is you want to help connect the young person and their family to a benefits counselor. Go see your friends. If you are VR, I know that you know how to do that. If you are on the special education side of the house, this is where you want to get to know your friends in VR. They're super helpful. They're going to know where you can find those. Oh, look, I love it. People are popping the links in the chat for me. Y'all are great. In addition to active and ongoing benefits, work incentives, counseling stuff, you can actually find your work incentives planning and assistance project, or your WIPA, which is the federally funded entity that does actually provide that service. However, they're going to categorize and prioritize who they're serving because, quite frankly, there's not enough of them to go around. So you really do want to be aware of that. And again, like I'm telling you, make friends with VR. They're good people. They're going to help you out. The last thing I want to talk about real quickly is ABLE accounts. ABLE stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience, and ABLE accounts are like the coolest tool, especially for young folks, because your disability onset had to have occurred before age 26, but it's a tax advantaged, protected savings account, folks, that anybody can contribute to, and that does not count for ongoing eligibility, and for income and or against your asset limit. So really key. There is a really great center called the ABLE National Resource Center that's housed by the National Disability Institute. We've included the link on the slide for you. Go check them out. They're going to provide so much more information about ABLE accounts that I can't barely squeeze in with 5 minutes left. So Kelly, you get like the last like 4 minutes and then we got to go back to Michael.
Yes. So that was great. And I think DJ hit it on the head when we were talking about this, and we purposely named this the big picture because there is a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of valuable resources out there. But if nothing else, know who to connect with so that your young person can get that benefits counseling that they need. And I love that DJ just went through all those really great resources, and I saw some popping up in chat as well. So in moving forward, we as professionals really need to change the narrative when we work with young people with disabilities who are living in or at poverty. And there are a couple of ways that we think that you can really go about changing that narrative. First of all, you have to change that culture or those beliefs and expectations. knowing that these youth can work and will be better off working, and we want to move them to family sustaining wages, financial stability. I think I saw in the chat earlier, somebody had put in that benefits planning needs to be part of transition planning. And I think that's really key, and especially when we're working with, absolutely when we're working with youth who are recipients of SSI. We also need to look at developing those partnerships. We of course know our worlds. We know the education world, we know VR world, but we have to think about those other non-traditional resources from the human service side of the house. In my work, we've connected a lot with foster care and social services who have lots of resources for these youth and families, but these systems need to start talking more to one another. And so just look at developing those connections and those partnerships. Approaching this holistically, we've touched on this throughout the whole thing. We need to look at working not only with the young person, the youth, the student, but we need to work with their family as a whole so we can break that cycle of poverty. But we also need to look at working with that youth within the context in which they are living, their environment, and taking all of that into consideration. There's a lot of good research from on this coming out of the recent Promise grants, discussion of family navigators and the use of family navigators to connect families, and better ways we can align and connect various resources. Also, what we learned through our work with Promise, and both DJ and I had the pleasure to work on some of those projects in various states, but making services more accessible to the youth and the families. We're talking about youth and families who have limited resources. And you are popping that into chat, transportation. So, you know, we want to give them our service. Well, let's not expect them to come meet with us in our office. Let's go out to them and meet them where they are and make it more convenient for them. So again, thinking about how to make our services more accessible and keeping those people, those youth and their families engaged. And then, and DJ talked so much about this, but it is so important to have that training on financial capability strategies and resources, or know who to connect with in your community. CWICs, your VR agency, as DJ mentioned, they are knowledgeable on this. They know where to connect you. So this is a starting point. And again, we hope there's a lot to cover in this presentation, and a lot we didn't get into, but it's an important topic. It's one that we're very passionate about, and just looking at how we can better provide access to important transition services for youth who have disabilities and living in poverty. So our next slide here, we just put a bunch of references. We talked about a lot of things, and it was all based on previous research and work that has been done, both DJ and I have been part of. So here's a list of references that you can dig into at your leisure. And with that, I am going to wrap it up. DJ, I don't know if you have anything else to add before we turn it over to Michael.
Just thanks, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us. We know we ran a couple minutes over.
Thank you.
So just want to remind folks that the PowerPoint, as well as the recording from today and chat notes will be available on the our NTACTC website, the transitionta.org. It's under feature items. There you will also be able to find the evaluation for today and that request for CRC credits. You'll also receive a reminder email from Zoom one day from now that will take you back to that site on our website. And if you have any questions or need any additional information, please send us an email at ntaccollab@uncc.edu. And with that, thank you for your participation today, and especially to Kelly and DJ for presenting such great information. You can find us again for our social media outlets, and those are listed on the screen. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.